Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to be looking at how we can start to add a little bit of a brighter kind of color variation and change to some of our edges now that we've dealt with kind of our cavities. So a lot of this that we're going to be doing is based off of the reference, and it's going to make this look a lot more complete and compelling and interesting because a lot of this metal has quite a bit of color variation to it. Now again, a lot of that's based off of the surface of the model, which is one thing I love about Substance, is that you do get all of this variation based on the shape of the model itself. So the main thing we want to do is just add another fill layer. We want to set its colors to something that's a little bit more yellow in this case. And again, I think I want to go with maybe a hard light for our base color. And we could lower some of the opacity of that a little bit so it's just a minor variation. But again, where we go exactly with that color is going to totally depend on what we've got underneath here. So we'll start with something like this. It might be a little bit obvious, but we'll just wait. We'll add in a black mask. Let's just affect some of our settings here. Again, we don't want to change our height. We don't want to change the rough or metal or normal. These things are not totally necessary to change here. We just want some kind of surface variation. Now what I am going to add in is just a simple little generator of our masks again, just so we kind of hit our edges. And what you'll see here is it's actually kind of giving us what we want right away. All we really need to do is start to maybe increase some of the little contrast in this so it's not quite so intense, and maybe just affect our curvature here. So we don't necessarily need quite so much soft detail. We don't necessarily need so much large, although the variation is quite nice most of the time. But we do want to push down the balance of this just a little bit more here, I think, and add just a little bit more contrast. I think those settings are going to make this just a little bit more compelling. But that little bit of yellow in this does give us this very, very interesting result to work with. I can press C, and you can see here that we're actually not even getting a super noticeable change here. It's nothing really complex. It's nothing really crazy. It's just very, very simple in this case, which is pretty much exactly what we want. And that is going to give us something pretty compelling right away. It starts to look like a pretty interesting metal right off the bat, just by adding a little bit of color variation, which is super important to understand when it comes to metals. That color variation can be hugely powerful. So that's pretty good, but what if we add just a little bit more here? So first off, let's just name this a little bit better. Yellow edges and aged, let's call this cavities. So let's just add a little bit more information here. Let's do one more. Let's add in just an empty fill layer and just drop this above. Oh, just drop this right here. And we're going to pop in a filter into this. Now this filter can actually have a finish to it. Now this can be very useful for us because we can start to drop in things like this finished brushed or finished grainy, or grinded. So let's grab this grinded one. Now what we can turn off is we don't need the color or any of that stuff, or even the roughness here, or rather the metalness, but we do want to keep the normal because that's going to give us some of this shape, and we could start to affect how some of this works. So for example, if we just go over to our roughness and actually lower the intensity of that roughness there, we can start to see this grinding show up a little bit more interestingly without necessarily being so intense in this case. We could also again press C, C, C to get to that roughness here and start to see how that's actually showing up in this case. Now, of course, we could bring that down quite a bit more so that we're getting a little bit more of the effect that we actually want out of this. And we could increase the intensity of that, that kind of grinded effect, but it's not really quite what we want here. We could lower the scale of it just a bit more if we wanted to get that looking a little bit more compelling, or increase the size of it so that it gets a little bit broader, but I don't think that's quite what we want. We might want something just nice and small here. And that works out pretty darn well for us. We could turn on triplanar projection, which will align some of these details just a little bit better. But that starts looking pretty interesting in this case. Now, we could even set this to something like screen, which would make that surface a bit more rough even than it was before, which is also a pretty good possibility for us in this case. Although it's not really brightening up too much, it's still pretty dark, which is not too bad in this case, but it's not really giving us a lot to work with here, as you can see. I could add in a fill in this case, something that's just going to allow for the roughness to be just a little bit more intense where this grinding goes. And that'll work out pretty darn well for us as well. So again, that roughness can kind of just be a little bit more intense towards our edges, which will be pretty interesting. And I could just start to add in a black mask, go back into our generator, pick that mask, and in this case I may want to just pick those edges again. So let's just go into our curvature, make sure we've got edges, and let's actually push the balance of that up quite a bit, just so we're seeing some pretty intense stuff, and go into our filter and drop in a blur. In this case, what that's going to do is kind of blur out the effect here, so that basically what we're going to get is some worn down edges showing up so that they have just a little bit of that kind of rough, torn away quality to them. But we could sort of tighten this up just a little bit more. I think some of these shapes are just a little bit too big for what we're working with here. And it might be good just to get a little bit closer to those edges. There we go. That'll start to be a little bit closer to what we want in this case. And we could even increase some of the contrast here so that this gets just a little bit softer. Maybe even pull this down just a little bit more as well. I think that works out pretty darn well. And that'll start to give us this kind of brushed quality on those edges. So as we turn this on and off, you'll see those edges are just getting a little bit softened as well, with a little bit of this brushed ground kind of quality showing up on any of these edges that we start to see here. So that we start to get just that little bit of a brushed kind of quality on those edges, and something that's going to look really, really nice. So the edges start to look a little bit more worn down than they were before, with a little bit of extra texture to them. And we get a little bit more color variation going on those edges as well. This whole thing just becomes a bit more compelling and a bit more interesting than it was in the first place. Next, we're going to add a little bit more broad scale, kind of simple color variation, just to make this whole thing pop in a bit more of a large scale kind of shape change.